In this video, I want to talk all about the color red, how to paint with it, how to mix your own red, and also why it can be just sort of a weird color sometimes. And despite learning that it's a basic or primary color, it actually has a ton of nuance and variance to it. And when you're first learning how to paint, you might be told to actually set up your palette with two different reds. One being the more orange and warm in temperature cadmium red, and the other being the more cool leaning alizarin crimson. Having both reds will allow you to paint a wider range and more realistic array of reds. A more practical example of this is to picture a cherry and a tomato. And although these colors look completely different, we consider both of them to be red. Having both red colors allows you to paint this entire range and handle this variance, including mixing other colors. You may have run into this when trying to mix a violet and discover that it gets super muddy. This can happen when using too warm or orange of a red. The orange in the color mixes with its complement, blue, and gets desaturated and creates a really neutral color instead of a nice violet like you'd get with a more crimson red. If you were to mix both of these colors together, you would get a really nice, pure, true red color, but you can also skip having both of these reds by instead mixing magenta with the yellow that is probably already on your palette. And this is really cool because we're taught that red is a primary color and it can't be mixed, but I found that 1 part magenta to about 2 parts yellow gives a really vivid, true red color that also has a lot of richness. In miniature painting, contrast is really key, and highlights really help us to define shape and pick out details on the models. But this can get kind of weird when painting with red, though, as adding white to red makes pink a completely different and separate color. So when you highlight red with pink, you're pulling that main color away from a true red closer to something pink. The really cool part about this, though, is that perception of pink and red might be due to the language that we speak. Languages develop color terms as a way to describe what they perceive as completely separate and unique colors. This usually starts with light and dark, and white and black, and then red, something completely different. And English is a language with color terms for both red and pink, influencing how we perceive these as completely distinct and separate colors. Other languages don't have both of these color terms, though, and what English speakers would refer to as pink, somebody who speaks Danish, for example, might instead call it light red. And I think it's super cool to imagine how everyone perceives colors differently. To get around this whole highlighting red with pink conundrum, sometimes miniature painters instead choose to mix in yellow or pale yellow into their red. This, of course, makes orange, though, which again is a completely separate color from red, pulling that main color away from a true red closer to something orange. And if this is how you enjoy painting red, I think that's super cool, but sometimes I like to keep my reds really pure red, and I do this by instead highlighting brighter reds over a darker color. In this case, I'm going to be using brown and purple on the skin of this hobgoblin so we can sort of see how the reds interact with the different colors, and that purple base coat is going to give more of a flush on the hands and face of the model. The reds I'm going to primarily be using for this are Gory Red and Mephiston Red. Gory Red is a nice cardinal red color, but is a bit medium in value, with the much more vivid and saturated Mephiston Red creating a great highlight that keeps everything a very pure red color. We layer up from our base coat with Gory Red, doing a couple passes to build up the vividness of the red but also reducing the amount of area covered with each pass to help build up and create shape, leaving the darker base coat in the shadows. I'm then going to use Mephiston Red and focus on the tops of each muscle, with more overall area covered towards the top of the model, like the shoulders and face, as these areas would be getting more light and we want to reinforce that. A lot of the time, if I'm painting just a section of cloth or something small, I'll leave it like this, but since we're painting such a prominent part of the model, I want to develop it a bit further with more highlights. As we talked about earlier, you could mix up your own red for this, especially if you have a really bright magenta, but a really vivid red that's readily available is Purell Red. This is super punchy and I use it to just pick out the most extreme parts of the arms and chest, focusing more on the shoulders and also really highlighting the facial features. And although we're sticking to mostly red for this, I do want to add that extra oomph of definition and a final touch by adding some specular highlights or tiny dots to just really help define the shapes and really carve out the details of the face. Using another model that I painted as reference, if we take a look at the true reflections from actual cast light, we can see although they are very light in value, they're also very desaturated, sort of browns and pinks. And we're going to mimic that by mixing some pastel emerald into our Purell Red. Being green, it will desaturate the red, and the overall lighter value will help make this a nice highlight color. I add just a tiny speck of this to the highest points on the shoulders, being sparse on the arms and using the highlights as a way to denote the different areas of the face, separating the cheeks from the brows and nose. If I made too large of a mark, I just glazed some Purell Red over it, knocking it back and creating a really nice translucent effect. And this is also a great way to get a bright red by starting with a really light color and glazing red over it. And although this is only one way to paint red, I really like it. I think it's really versatile and effective, as well as really vivid and engaging. If you want something even brighter, you can sort of skip the earlier steps and jump into the more vivid reds, knocking back the shadows where needed instead of building up from them. I think the most important takeaway is, no matter how vivid or bright your red is, to keep it looking a pure red, you want most of the object to be rendered with red, using the shadows to your advantage, keeping your highlights super red, and only just a tiny specular highlight of a desaturated light color. Thanks for watching.